Insurance fraud in the UK costs more than £1.2 billion a year. That's more than £3 million a day. Deliberate crashes, bogus personal injuries, even phantom pets. The fraudsters are risking more and more to make a quick killing, and every year it's adding more than £50 to your insurance bill. But insurers are fighting back, exposing a fraudulent claim every 5 minutes, armed with the latest fraud-busting technology, including covert surveillance systems, sophisticated data analysis techniques, and specially trained fraud investigators. They're catching these chances red-handed. Instead of getting away with it, more and more of these fraudsters are being caught out and claimed and shamed. Coming up, a claim for €250,000 goes up in flames when a holiday fire turns out to be all smoke and mirrors.
My colleague in France travelled, and what he found there was a building that was at least 100 years old, run down, unoccupied, and with no signs of fire damage whatsoever.
And a martial arts expert's case is given the chop when his social media posts expose his lies.
The claimant posted quite a number of taekwondo moves. These were quite extraordinary shots, with one shot with him kicking above his head, which would be quite difficult if you're suffering from a very bad back injury.
Regular viewers of Claimed and Shamed will know we like nothing more than exposing the liars, cheats and scammers who go to great lengths to make dodgy insurance claims for vast sums of cash that isn't rightfully theirs. Today, we focus on the array of investigative methods that go into catching these chances out, whether it's old-fashioned door-to-door inquiries, analysing unwise social media posts, cross-referencing clumsily forged documents, or trawling for evidence on CCTV. We start with a large-scale fraud which crossed international borders. This elaborate scam involved a fire, bogus identities and a fake farmhouse, giving the investigators a real run for their money. This case centres around a couple who lived in Milan, who went on holiday to France, but who took out travel cover with an insurance company based in the UK. When a fire broke out at their accommodation in France, the pair made a claim on their policy for €250,000. The claim came to the attention of Steve Crystal at Sedgwick. The company handles claims on behalf of insurers around the world, with colleagues located in around 100 countries, specialising in investigating international cases. Even with 25 years of experience in tackling fraud, Steve had his work cut out.
Claimants in the case were an Italian female and a French male who were a couple, and a French female national.
In February 2019, the couple flew to France to stay at a guest house, 200 kilometres to the east of Paris. All was well, until they went out for dinner one evening.
The couple described going out for the evening and having left a candle burning in the property whilst they were out. They explained that when they returned later in the evening, they found that there'd been a significant fire and had assumed that the candle had caught a curtain and spread throughout the property.
Even though the damage was extensive, rather mysteriously, the fire had already been extinguished by the time they got back.
Their assumption was that the fire had caused pipework within the building to melt, that had in turn allowed water to escape, and that itself had put out the fire. And for that reason, they advised that the fire brigade had not been called.
This explanation didn't sit well with Steve.
My experience would be that the fire brigade would always be called in a significant incident.
As the French owner of the holiday cottage did not have property insurance, she had to make a claim for the damage to the building and loss of rent through the couple's holiday insurance policy. Also included in the claim were the couple's personal possessions that had been damaged in the fire. The total value was huge.
The claim itself was in the order of €250,000.
The insurers needed to see evidence to back up this substantial claim, starting with photos of the destruction.
The damage appeared significant, both in terms of fire damage and smoke damage.
Steve's nose was twitching.
What was notable was not so much in the way of water damage. And I found that puzzling, given the couple had explained that the fire had seemingly been put out by water escaping from melted pipework.
Despite the suspicious circumstances, a substantial amount of paperwork had been submitted as evidence.
There was the guest house booking documents, the travel documents from Milan to Paris, the statement of claim that had been made, signed by both the couple and the claimant, and also a brochure which the couple had explained they'd found online and responded to, which had led them to booking the guest house. Now, at face value, the documents seemed plausible and were in line with what the insurer had asked for.
A closer look at the emails the couple had provided did raise eyebrows, though, suggesting a potential link between the couple and the French host.
We noted that the couple and the claimant had corresponded using the same email provider. Standard practice would be to analyse those email addresses to identify the internet protocol or IP addresses. Had we been successful in verifying the IP addresses, it would have led us to understand whether the same devices were being used for the correspondence, whether the correspondence was authentic, and maybe the names and possibly locations of the users. But we found that this particular provider, difficult to identify that information.
With the emails proving to be a dead end, Steve moved on to the holiday brochure and travel documents.
The brochure itself appeared plausible and professional and credible. Insofar as the travel documentation is concerned, again, this appeared plausible. It showed flights between Milan and Paris on the dates in question, insofar as they matched the booking dates for the guest house. Additionally, they attached boarding card receipts, which again were in the name of the couple and appeared plausible.
But then he noticed something strange about other evidence that had been submitted, starting with repair estimates for the cottage.
They were from two French businesses, located in the Paris area, so some 200 kilometres away from the property. That seemed unusual.
Not only unusual, but also non-existent.
Further inquiries into both builders identified that these businesses had failed some time previously and were no longer going concerns. That begged the question to me, how could these businesses be providing estimates for remedial work if they don't exist?
There were other things that also looked highly irregular.
The Italian female used a mobile number which we identified as being a French-issued number. Now, mindful that she is an Italian citizen living in Italy, we found that unusual. And when we tried to trace it, we found it was untraceable. The policy was taken out at an address in Milan, in Italy. When we did some online research in respect to that address, we couldn't find it. It was a false address.
But even more concrete evidence of wrongdoing had been under Steve's nose the whole time.
We used an online tool to look at the metadata of the photographs themselves. And the metadata is the properties that lie behind a digital image that help identify where it was taken and when it was taken. We found that the metadata on one of the photographs showed that the image had been taken 11 months prior to the fire that was reported by the couple. This begged an obvious question. How can they submit a photograph that was taken 11 months before the incident took place?
With alarm bells now ringing loudly, Steve decided that more drastic action had to be taken.
I felt it was beneficial to go to the property. My colleague in France travelled, and what he found there was a building that was at least 100 years old, run down, unoccupied, and with no signs of fire damage whatsoever. I asked my colleague on the ground in France to make some local inquiries of neighbours, local shopkeepers. Those inquiries yielded that there had never been a guest house there. The property had been unoccupied and run down for a number of years. Additionally, inquiries with the local municipal office showed that the property had never been known as the name that the claimant had given it, and that the registered owner of the property was not the claimant. And certainly, looking back at the brochure for the property, the building we were standing in front of was not the same one. Analysing everything that we collated, it was apparent that there had been no fire at the address given and that this was a false claim.
There was no doubt that the holiday cottage and fire had been the work of fiction and that this was a clear case of fraud. Stephen needed to talk to all the individuals involved, but he now suspected they too were an elaborate invention.
There was no response from the Italian couple and the French claimant, who had been pressurising for settlement pretty much continuously from the beginning, suddenly went quiet on us.
For Steve, this could only mean one thing.
A person, or some people, creating false identities, using untraceable mobile numbers, using masked email addresses to take out an insurance policy and target that by fraud with a view to monetary gain.
The fact that genuine flight details had been submitted as evidence also suggested an even bigger operation was at play.
2 people had travelled on a flight from Milan to Paris. What that told me was that these false identities must have had some sort of documentation to travel by. That in turn infers a degree of sophistication.
Using fake identity documents to travel is a serious criminal offence, which can lead to a prison sentence.
I made some further inquiries, and through those inquiries, I discovered 2 other claims where the same property had featured in a very similar claim.
Steve now realised he was potentially dealing with a huge, well-coordinated scam, and it appeared to already have had some success.
The first of those 2 other claims had taken place around 10 months before the matter that I was dealing with a different insurer, and that claim had been paid. And the value was in the region of €200,000. The third claim was made around 10 months after the matter that I dealt with. That claim was again with a different insurer. It was identified as suspect, and it was no payment made. Total cost of those would have been, had they been settled, around €500,000.
It was now becoming clear why a policy for a couple in Italy had been taken out with an insurer based in the UK.
What I concluded was that this was a group of French citizens. Their method of operating appeared to be the taking out of a policy or policies online, but using overseas carriers as a way of deflecting perceived inquiries. My guess is that those involved did not anticipate that we would make inquiries abroad.
Despite a police investigation, these particular fraudsters were never identified. But Steve's diligent work still meant another scam was stopped in its tracks. And that's good news for all of us.
What I'm increasingly seeing is insurers with an appetite to tackle claims fraud all around the globe. And with that in mind, helping insurers tackle fraud internationally is beneficial for insurer clients, but also helps protect the vast majority of genuine customers and helps keep their premiums as low as possible.
Later, caught on camera, 2 roofers involved in a minor bash with a bus see their claims slated when they play fast and loose with the facts, and the insurance investigators get stuck in.
The camera doesn't lie, and you can see exactly what happened. There's multiple cameras, and on this occasion it was captured in great detail.
More than 500,000 people a year are injured at work. These injuries can be life-changing, and if the accident wasn't your fault, you could be entitled to financial compensation for loss of earnings, as well as providing long-term care. Whilst most claims are genuine, insurance investigators must use all their powers of detection to work out the real injuries from the fake ones. Our next case concerns an employee who was involved in a collision with a pallet truck whilst packing salad at a food preparation plant. His employer was covered by NFU Mutual, and David Phillips dealt with the claim.
In 2016, the claimant alleged that whilst he was at work, he was hit from behind in his back by a pallet truck. The claimant was taken to A&E, where he was seen by medical experts and discharged. The claimant alleged that he'd suffered very significant back injury.
Although the accident happened in 2016, it took 3 years for the injured man to put in an insurance claim against his employer. He was claiming the back injury was still causing serious problems.
He was alleging that he had chronic pain, and which caused him anxiety, sleeplessness and fatigue. He was also claiming for ongoing and future losses, including loss of earnings and future care, which would have made the claim worth about £250,000 to £280,000.
A hefty claim, making the fact that he'd taken so long to submit it even more extraordinary. Not even his bosses, insured by NFU Mutual, had clocked the seriousness of the incident. The man had only had 1 day off sick, and he'd left the company 4 months later without even saying he thought it was responsible.
It was unusual because our insured hadn't reported this accident to us because they had thought it hadn't been a major claim at the time.
With concerns about this claim from the outset, David and his team were asked to look into it. And straight away, they discovered inconsistencies in the man's story.
We used a claims inspector to investigate the circumstances of the incident and also the background of the claimant.
The inspector discovered that the claimant was a martial arts expert, despite the fact that he'd said in his claim that he hadn't played sports for 19 years. David wanted to know whether his back injury had affected his ability to enjoy his hobby.
We used our intelligence teams to look at the social media of the claimant. We noted that he had posted online that he was in South Korea with a grandmaster of Taekwondo.
A mere 12 days after the accident, he'd made it out to South Korea. He also kept his friends up to date on how he was feeling.
Whilst the claimant was in South Korea at the Taekwondo event, one of his friends on Facebook had asked him how he was. The claimant had actually posted that he was fine. This was in complete contrast to him saying he was off work with a very bad back injury.
And then, less than 2 months after that, things seemed to be going extremely well for this fitness fanatic.
The claimant posted on social media several pictures of him performing quite a number of Taekwondo moves in a park around the local area to where he lived. These were quite extraordinary shots, with one shot with him kicking above his head, which would be quite difficult if you're suffering from a very bad back injury.
In fact, it seems his Taekwondo had gone from strength to strength in the months immediately following the accident.
The claimant was boasting that he'd gone through several levels of the black belt arrangement with Taekwondo following the alleged incident. This showed to us that the claimant was probably far more active than he was alleging some 2 or 3 years later when he brought the claim to us. We were also able to find out through social media that the claimant had set himself up as a Taekwondo instructor and coach and was offering coaching classes in his local area.
Unaware that this evidence was being gathered, this martial arts expert began legal proceedings to get his payout. In order to support his case, he submitted a medical report from an orthopaedic surgeon he'd visited 6 months after the accident. At first, the report seemed to back up his story.
The medical report identified that the claimant had suffered some sort of back injury around the time of the incident, and following the accident, the claimant had been in to see A&E.
David noticed the report also revealed something else.
The orthopaedic surgeon's report told us that the claimant had actually had some major surgery some 10 years before the alleged incident for an ongoing sciatica problem. The report showed us that the claimant's injury may not have been related to an incident that happened to our insured's premises. It may have actually been related to an ongoing medical condition he had prior to the incident.
So the claimant had a pre-existing back condition that he'd failed to declare. And the expert had noticed something even more troubling about the claimant's visit to his surgery.
The orthopaedic surgeon commented that the claimant had exhibited some unusual behaviours whilst he was being examined. He had turned up using 2 crutches, which was unusual for this type of injury. The orthopaedic surgeon also commented that the claimant had been making inappropriate noises during his examination, which didn't seem to relate to the incident or the pain or the injury.
Had the claimant been faking it? Either way, his story just wasn't adding up. David was now determined to get to the bottom of things.
The claimant and his solicitors clearly felt that they had a strong case, and we felt that they didn't. So we instructed them to make a statement of truth to set out the claimant's version of events and to be very specific about the injury he was now claiming. This was all done so that this could be put in front of a court if required. In the statement of truth, the claimant stated that he couldn't do martial arts, even though we hadn't asked the question.
David finally had the claimant on the ropes.
We then sent back to the claimant the social media posts we had uncovered of the claimant undertaking martial arts following the incident and in subsequent years following the incident.
He'd been caught out in a lie, fair and square, and he wanted out.
He then made an application to withdraw his claim because he has suddenly realised that we were onto him and this was not a real claim after all.
But with so much time and money already wasted investigating the case, it was now time for David to turn the legal screws.
We made an application to obtain exceptional costs because we had incurred costs in investigating the claim and dealing with the litigation.
And things were about to go from bad to worse for the martial arts guru.
The claimant solicitors then told us that they were coming off record and were not going to be acting for the claimant anymore. This may be because they realised that the game was up and they weren't going to make any money from this case.
A date was set for the hearing at Boston County Court in Lincoln. But on the day itself, one person was notable by his absence.
We and our legal representatives attended the county court to hear the case, and the judge was waiting and sitting for the claimant to appear. Unfortunately, he failed to appear at all, wasting our time and the court's time. In his absence, the judge found that the claimant had been fundamentally dishonest.
For David and his team, this was the outcome they'd hoped for.
The judge awarded us £21,000 costs, which we could recover directly from the claimant. This was a very good result for ourselves and our policyholders because the money we save from defending these claims help us to reduce the premiums that the honest customers have to pay.
And there will be other far-reaching consequences for this scammer.
The claimant will also be added to the insurance fraud register so that other insurers and financial institutions can be aware that this man has made suspicious and fraudulent claims.
Despite the win, David is still left with a bad taste in his mouth.
The claimant put in a claim which he clearly thought would make him a lot of money. We're not sure why he wanted to do this, but the amount of money and the amount of claim being made, it was clearly greed that led him to put the claim in.
And David is even more surprised that a supposed master of martial arts embarked on such a dubious claim in the first place.
We understand that the values of a Taekwondo expert are that you have respect, you don't back away from a fight, and you don't have any ethical faults. This is completely in contrast what we saw with this claimant, where he was clearly lying and didn't turn up to court when he had the opportunity to fight to defend his position.
Still to come, a window cleaner finds himself all washed up when his dirty tricks land him on the wrong side of the law.
The insurers involved in this particular claim were extremely vexed by the conduct of the claimant, who had committed some very serious contempt of court and attempted to get away with stealing effectively £500,000.
In this country, before people are allowed behind the wheel of a bus, they have to undergo rigorous training and obtain a professional driving qualification. This is all valuable stuff, but it can still be tricky for a driver to guide what is a pretty bulky vehicle down some of our narrow streets. With nearly 40,000 buses on our roads, it isn't altogether surprising that the odd accident does happen. And it's up to the fraud investigators to make sure the facts of the case stack up. Around 5,000 of those buses driving around are operated by First Bus. Paul Johnson works for the company as a senior legal assistant. He was asked to look into a case after a bus was involved in a collision with a stationary works van whilst manoeuvring down a busy street.
On the face of it, the incident seemed to be fairly straightforward. Our bus driver stopped to allow some traffic coming. There was a parked van on his left. That cleared. And then he went to overtake the van. Unfortunately, the near side wing mirror of the bus clipped the ladders on top of the van as it went past.
There were two men in the van at the time of the accident, who both worked as roofers, the man behind the wheel and his passenger.
The driver got out and discussed the matter with the bus driver. Details were exchanged and they both went on their way.
Following company procedure, the bus driver promptly reported what had happened.
The bus driver telephoned the incident shortly after it occurred. He gave full details of the accident. He admitted that the near side wing mirror clipped the ladder on top of the van and that the incident occurred at a very low speed, around 5 miles an hour.
Based on the bus driver's testimony, Paul and his team expected they'd only have to pay out a small amount for the damaged ladder. So they were surprised when the roofers got in touch, asking for a great deal more.
They were alleging that not only the damage to the ladder, which the bus driver had said that he caused, but also damage to the offside rear of the van, including around the lights. That would have made the van technically unroadworthy, so they were also claiming for the hire of a van as well.
The roofers said it had been a significant collision and that the bus had been travelling at around 20 miles per hour when it hit them, much faster than the 5 miles per hour the bus driver had claimed, and with enough acceleration to leave them with injuries.
The van driver and the passenger claimed that the impact was sufficient enough for them to be thrown forwards and backwards, sustaining an injury.
Both claimants said they'd visited A&E following the accident and had suffered with soft tissue injuries to their neck, shoulders and back. And that wasn't all.
Both the van driver and the passenger stated that they also attended physio following the accident to help with their recovery. They also claimed they were suffering from shock and restricted work as well, so they couldn't work for several days after the accident due to the injuries they sustained.
Quite the catalogue of woes. If it paid out, this would be an expensive case for First Bus to settle.
So in total, the claim for the van driver and the passenger would have been in the region of £20,000.
But there was a hole in these roofers' story. Unusually, they weren't claiming enough.
I was very surprised to note that despite the van driver and the passenger claiming they were unable to work due to the injuries, that we never received a claim for any loss of earnings.
For Paul, this discrepancy raised further doubts about the case, particularly as both parties involved were telling two very different stories.
The bus driver's version was nowhere near the same as what the van driver and the passenger was alleging. The speed was a lot lower and the area of the impact was completely different.
Paul needed to find out who was telling the truth. Luckily, following the accident, the bus driver had the foresight to collect some evidence, which went some way to backing up his account.
The bus driver took some photos at the scene and they didn't seem to show any major impact at all.
As compelling as these images were, Paul required firmer evidence. He knew exactly where to look for it. All first buses are fitted with multiple cameras to keep passengers and drivers safe, and the CCTV had captured the whole thing.
The footage showed that the bus was travelling at around 5 miles an hour, as the bus driver had reported, and not the 20 miles an hour as alleged by the van driver and the passenger.
So far, so good. And the footage had more to disclose.
There was no movement of the van. We'd be very, very surprised if anybody could have been injured in this incident.
This CCTV evidence had put a massive dent in the roofer's personal injury claims. But what did it reveal about the supposed damage to the van?
The footage showed that only the near side wing mirror of the bus came into contact with the ladder on the van. The rest of the bus didn't get anywhere near the van, and quite clearly the damage alleged to have been caused was not caused in this incident. It seemed to be old damage.
Paul was more than satisfied with this CCTV evidence, which firmly backed the bus driver's version of events.
The camera doesn't lie, and you can see exactly what happened. There's multiple cameras, and on this occasion it was captured in great detail.
The footage proved the claims for damage to the van and for the personal injuries were bogus. With this ace up his sleeve, Paul set about preparing the rest of his defence, turning his attention to the medical report the driver of the van had submitted. He was surprised that the expert had said the injuries would persist for 12 months, which was an opinion based on nothing but the roofer's say-so.
This was purely based on what the van driver told him regarding how bad the accident was and how the injuries were still affecting him.
Paul wondered if the medical expert's diagnosis would have been different had he seen the CCTV footage.
Hopefully, he would have realised that what he had been told was completely inaccurate.
For Paul, however, who had the advantage of having seen the video, there was only one possible outcome for this case.
We made a small payment for the damage to the ladders, which was a genuine part of the claim, and we denied everything else for the damage to the van, the hire, and certainly the injury claims.
Paul and his team sent copies of their CCTV evidence to the claimant's solicitor, who decided to step away from the claims. Surprisingly, though, that still wasn't the end of the matter.
The van driver and his passenger weren't deterred by this. They went to a different firm of solicitors and told them the same version of events as per their original claim, which we'd already disproven once. We received a claim from new solicitors, and we did exactly the same. We sent a copy of the CCTV to the second set of solicitors, and again, we heard nothing from them.
The CCTV evidence really was the ace in this case, saving First Bus from having to pay out £20,000 for these two opportunistic claims.
We were very pleased with the outcome. We never heard from the van driver or his passenger again, and it clearly shows that the CCTV always shows the truth. I think that the van driver and his passenger just didn't realise that how many cameras were fitted to the bus and that they're fitted to all our clients' buses, and thought they could get away with it, and quite clearly they couldn't.
Insurance fraud investigators deal with almost 100,000 dodgy claims every year. Some brazen scammers will stop at nothing to try to get hold of thousands of pounds unlawfully. But it's a risky business. With some serious sleuthing by our top investigators, those who get caught could end up facing a hefty prison sentence. Our final case started off as a relatively small claim made by a couple after a crash, but then escalated into something much bigger. Lawyer Damien Rourke investigated the claim.
The claimant in this case was a man in his 50s who was involved in a relatively minor road traffic accident. They were stationary at a set of traffic lights, and our policyholder drove into the rear of their vehicle. The first claim we received was from the claimant's wife. The claim came in 2013. It was a relatively minor claim for a whiplash-type injury with some very minor vehicle damage, and it settled in total for about £4,500.
However, A further claim from the husband didn't come in until 3 years later, just before the deadline to make a claim ran out. And somehow, he'd been much more seriously injured than his wife.
Despite this being a relatively minor accident, the injuries that were claimed were chronic pain syndrome, a minor traumatic brain injury, and a severe laceration to his little finger, which all had ongoing effects on his ability to work. He was effectively housebound. His enjoyment of life was crushed, basically. This was a life-changing event on his evidence. The suggestion was that because of these injuries, he was unable to work for a full year post-accident.
The value of the claim, which included past and future loss of earnings, was substantial, and it kept rising.
It started at £300,000. As matters moved on, and he said his injuries were more and more significant and were failing to recover, the claim value eventually climbed to over £500,000.
The enterprising man, who'd claimed he'd been working full-time in a well-paid job as a machine operator before the accident, had a plan to get back on his feet. And the insurance company had been happy to support him.
They agreed to make an interim payment that he asked for to start a window cleaning business, to buy equipment and so on and so forth, in the sum of £40,000.
Before handing over that 40 grand, the insurance company wanted to see evidence that his new business startup was genuine.
In support of that interim payment, he provided us with various documents. Amongst that, there were 3 critical documents in this case. There was an invoice for the window cleaning equipment. There was an invoice for a van dated April 2015. The van in question was an automatic, and he said he needed that because he could no longer drive stick due to his hand injury. And finally, he said that he had to get signage for the van for his window cleaning company, and so there was an invoice for signage livery.
Damien and his team began looking at the documents in detail and talked to the firms that had issued them.
When we contacted the company who had sold the van, they said actually it wasn't sold in April 2015 at all. It was sold 2 years prior to that, which would rather indicate that it wasn't purchased to set up the window cleaning business. Now, taking it a step further, they also said that not only was the van not an automatic, it was actually a manual transmission, but in addition to that, the mileage on it was wrong. And so it looked very much like the invoice had been fabricated.
The van had been purchased in 2013, just 2 months after the accident. During the time, the claimant said he was incapacitated and couldn't work. And his own social media confirmed the date on the invoice was a work of fiction.
We did some further searches in relation to this vehicle, and social media searches of the claimant's Facebook account showed that the van was parked on the driveway, liveried up 6 months before he said he purchased it.
This claim wasn't adding up. Damien and his team turned their attention to the other documents, starting with the invoice for almost £6,000 worth of cleaning equipment.
Our intelligence team directly contacted the company that had purportedly sold the equipment and provided them with a copy of that invoice. Well, they recognised it to a point, but actually provided us with the real invoice, which instead of being for £5,772, was actually for the purchase of £180 worth of equipment. Now, the crucial point that we got from this invoice was that it was actually dated in reality a year prior to the date that the invoice that he had provided with us claimed.
It looked like the dates on 2 out of the 3 invoices submitted by the window cleaner had been altered to look like they'd been issued after the crash. But what about the 3rd, the one for the signage on his van?
Again, this was dated in April 2015, but we contacted the company and they said, no, actually, this invoice was prepared in June 2014, which is almost a year prior to when the claimant had said he set up the business or attempted to set up the business.
All 3 receipts had been altered and all 3 purchases had been made at least a year before the claimant said they were, during the time he was supposedly unable to work. Damien was not happy.
And what that meant was that his entire medical evidence on which his claim was predicated was complete nonsense because he was making it all up.
Damien took a closer look into the claimant's background, and what he found shocked him.
When we reviewed the medical evidence, one of the things that the claimant said was that prior to the accident, he was in continuous employment. Quite well remunerated employment, actually. When we looked into his background, however, that simply wasn't true at all. And in fact, he had only just 9 days before the accident been released from prison, from where he had been serving a term of 8 years.
Even though the ex-con was lying about his past, he was willing to go on the record to confirm the contents of the paperwork he'd submitted to back up this claim was genuine.
When we gathered all this evidence together and we were able to tie the claimant into saying that these invoices were genuine, we were in a position where we could amend the claim to plead a positive case of fraud and dishonesty against the claimant, which is what we did. We made the application to the court.
When the court convened to consider whether he'd lied, the window cleaner got cold feet.
On the day that that application was supposed to be heard by the judge, the claimant emailed into the court apologising for lying and seeking to discontinue his claim.
But the judge wasn't having it.
The court actually struck out his claim and ordered him to pay the cost. Now, ordinarily that might be the end of the case, but the insurers involved in this particular claim were extremely vexed by the conduct of the claimant, who had committed some very serious contempt of court and attempted to get away with stealing effectively £500,000. So in all the circumstances, what they decided to do was to bring proceedings against that claimant for contempt of court.
The claimant knew he'd reached the end of the road and tried to wriggle out of it one last time. But by now, it was too late.
Before the hearing took place, the claimant admitted that he had lied on a statement of truth and committed contempt of court, and the judge sentenced him to 7 months in prison and ordered him to pay the costs of bringing the contempt proceedings against him.
For Damien, some aspects of this case were simply beyond the pale.
The surprising thing about this, I think, was how brazen the claimant was in terms of the documents that he put forward. To put forward a claim where one says, I'm injured and one is not, that's one thing. But to sit down and actually start tinkering with genuine documents and turn them into something different, that's not a short job. It's a lengthy, considered deceit rather than an instantaneous sort of, I'm going to say this is wrong and it wasn't. It's more dishonest in a way.
Another shocking case of deception and a timely reminder that we all need to remain vigilant to the scourge of insurance fraud. From chancers exaggerating injury to criminal gangs engineering crashes for cash, these tricksters hit us all in the pocket. Every year, insurers lose millions to these scams, and it's you, the policyholder, who ends up paying the price in hikes to your premiums. But the sheer number of thieves caught in the act sends a clear message to anyone thinking about cheating the system. They claimed, but now they're shamed.